You never saw fit to investigate the risks of unregulated credit default swaps?
I never did.
Same question with regard to executive compensation, the regulation of corporate governance, the effect of political contributions.
I don't know that I would have anything to add to those discussions.
I'm looking at your resume now. It looks to me as if the majority of your outside activities are consulting and directorship arrangements with the financial services industry. Would you not agree with that characterization?
No, to my knowledge, I don't think my consulting clients are even on my CV, so I don't know.
Who are your consulting clients?
I don't believe I have to discuss that with you.
Okay.
In fact, you have a few more minutes and the interview's over.
Do you consult for any financial services firms?
The answer is I do. But I do not want to go into details about that.
Do they include other financial services firms?
Possibly.
You don't remember?
This isn't a deposition, sir. I was polite enough to give you time. Foolishly, I now see, but you have 3 more minutes. Give it your best shot.
In 2004, at the height of the bubble, Glenn Hubbard co-authored a widely read paper with William C. Dudley, the chief economist of Goldman Sachs. In the paper, Hubbard praised credit derivatives and the securitization chain, stating that they had improved allocation of capital and were enhancing financial stability. He cited reduced volatility in the economy and stated that recessions had become less frequent and milder. Credit derivatives were protecting banks against losses and helping to distribute risk.
A medical researcher writes an article saying, to treat this disease, you should prescribe this drug. Turns out doctor makes 80% of personal income from manufacture of this drug. Does not bother you?
I think it's certainly important to disclose well, I think that's also a little different from cases that we're talking about here because
So, what do you think this says about the economics discipline?
Well, I mean, it has no relevance to anything, really. And indeed, I think it's an important part of the problem.
The rising power of the U.S. financial sector was part of a wider change in America. Since the 1980s, the United States has become a more unequal society, and its economic dominance has declined. Companies like General Motors, Chrysler, and U.S. Steel, formerly the core of the U.S. economy, were poorly managed and falling behind their foreign competitors. And as countries like China opened their economies, American companies sent jobs overseas to save money.
For many, many years, the 660 million people in the developed world were effectively sheltered from all of this additional labor that existed on the planet. Suddenly, the bamboo curtain and the iron curtain are lifted, and you have 2.5 billion additional people.
American factory workers were laid off by the tens of thousands.
Our manufacturing base was destroyed literally over the course of a few years.
As manufacturing declined, other industries rose. The United States leads the world in information technology, where high-paying jobs are easy to find. But those jobs require an education. And for average Americans, college is increasingly out of reach. While top private universities like Harvard have billions of dollars in their endowments, funding for public universities is shrinking, and tuition is rising. Tuition for California's public universities rose from $650 in the 1970s to over $10,000 in 2010. Increasingly, the most important determinant of whether Americans go to college is whether they can find the money to pay for it. Meanwhile, American tax policy shifted to favor the wealthy.
When I first came to office, I thought taxes were too high, and they were.
The most dramatic change was a series of tax cuts designed by Glenn Hubbard, who at the time was serving as President Bush's chief economic advisor. The Bush administration sharply reduced taxes on investment gains, stock dividends, and eliminated the estate tax.
We had a comprehensive plan that, when acted, has left nearly $1.1 trillion in the hands of American workers, families, investors, and small business owners.
Most of the benefits of these tax cuts went to the wealthiest 1% of Americans.
And by the way, it was really the cornerstone in many ways of our economic recovery policy.
Inequality of wealth in the United States is now higher than in any other developed country. American families responded to these changes in two ways: by working longer hours and by going into debt.
As the middle class falls further and further behind, there is a political urge to respond by making it easier to get credit.
You don't have to have a lousy home. The low-income home buyer can have just as nice a house as anybody else.
American families borrowed to finance their homes, their cars, their health care, and their children's educations.
People in the bottom 90% lost ground between 1980 and 2007. It all went to the top 1%.
For the first time in history, average Americans have less education and are less prosperous than their parents.
The era of greed and irresponsibility on Wall Street and in Washington has led us to a financial crisis as serious as any that we faced since the Great Depression.
When the financial crisis struck just before the 2008 election, Barack Obama pointed to Wall Street greed and regulatory failures as examples of the need for change in America.
A lack of oversight in Washington and on Wall Street is exactly what got us into this mess.
After taking office, President Obama spoke of the need to reform the financial industry.
We want a systemic risk regulator, increased capital requirements. We need a consumer financial protection agency. That we need to change Wall Street's culture.
But when finally enacted in mid-2010, the administration's financial reforms were weak, and in some critical areas, including the rating agencies, lobbying, and compensation, nothing significant was even proposed.
Addressing Obama and, quote, regulatory reform, my response, if it was one word, would be, ha. There's very little reform.
How come?
It's a Wall Street government.
Obama chose Timothy Geithner as Treasury Secretary. Geithner was the president of the New York Federal Reserve during the crisis, and one of the key players in the decision to pay Goldman Sachs 100 cents on the dollar for its bets against mortgages.
When Tim Geithner was testifying to be confirmed as Treasury Secretary, he said, "I have never been a regulator." Now that said to me, he did not understand his job as president of the New York Fed.
The new president of the New York Fed is William C. Dudley, the former chief economist of Goldman Sachs, whose paper with Glenn Hubbard praised derivatives. Geithner's chief of staff is Mark Patterson, a former lobbyist for Goldman. And one of the senior advisors is Louis Sachs, who oversaw Tricadia, a company heavily involved in betting against the mortgage securities it was selling. To head the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, Obama picked Gary Gensler, a former Goldman Sachs executive who had helped ban the regulation of derivatives. To run the Securities and Exchange Commission, Obama picked Mary Shapiro, the former CEO of FINRA, the investment banking industry's self-regulation body. Obama's chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, made $320,000 serving on the board of Freddie Mac. Both Martin Feldstein and Laura Tyson are members of Obama's Economic Recovery Advisory Board. And Obama's chief economic advisor is Larry Summers.
The most senior economic advisors are the very people who were there who built the structure.
Then it was clear that Summers and Geithner were going to play major roles
as advisors first. I knew this was going to be status quo.
The Obama administration resisted regulation of bank compensation, even as foreign leaders took action.
I think the financial industry is a service industry. It should serve others before it serves itself.
In September of 2009, Christine Lagarde and the finance ministers of Sweden, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Italy, Spain, and Germany called for the G20 nations, including the United States, to impose strict regulations on bank compensation. And in July of 2010, the European Parliament enacted those very regulations. The Obama administration had no response.
Their view is this is a temporary blip and things will go back to normal.
And that is why I am reappointing him to another term as chairman of the Federal Reserve. Thank you so much.
In 2009, Barack Obama reappointed Ben Bernanke.
Thank you, Mr. President.
As of mid-2010, not a single senior financial executive had been criminally prosecuted or even arrested. No special prosecutor had been appointed. Not a single financial firm had been prosecuted criminally for securities fraud or accounting fraud. The Obama administration has made no attempt to recover any of the compensation given to financial executives during the bubble.
I certainly would think of criminal action against some of Countrywide's top leaders like Mazzillo. I'd certainly look at Bear Stearns, Goldman Sachs, and Lehman Brothers, and Merrill Lynch.
For criminal prosecutions?
Yes.
Yes. In regard
They'd be
to...
very hard to win. But I think they could do it if they got enough underlings to tell the truth.
In an industry in which drug use, prostitution, and fraudulent billing of prostitutes as a business expense occur on an industrial scale, it wouldn't be hard to make people talk if you really wanted to.
They gave me a plea bargain and I took it. They were not interested in any of my records. They weren't interested in anything.
They were not interested in your records?
That's correct. That's correct.
There's a sensibility that you don't use people's personal vices in the context of Wall Street cases necessarily to get them to flip. I think maybe it's after the cataclysms that we've been through, maybe people will reevaluate that. I'm not the one to pass judgment on that right now.
You come to us today telling us we're sorry, we didn't mean it, we won't do it again. Trust us. Well, I have some people in my constituency that actually robbed some of your banks. And they say the same thing. They're sorry, they didn't mean it, they won't do it again.
In 2009, as unemployment hit its highest level in 17 years, Morgan Stanley paid its employees over $14 billion, and Goldman Sachs paid out over $16 billion. In 2010, bonuses were even higher.
Why should a financial engineer be paid four times to 100 times more than a real engineer? A real engineer build bridges, and a financial engineer build dreams. And when those dreams turn out to be nightmares, other people pay for it.
For decades, the American financial system was stable and safe. But then something changed. The financial industry turned its back on society, corrupted our political system, and plunged the world economy into crisis. At enormous cost, we've avoided disaster and are recovering. But the men and institutions that caused the crisis are still in power, and that needs to change. They will tell us that we need them, and that what they do is too complicated for us to understand. They will tell us it won't happen again. They will spend billions fighting reform. It won't be easy. But some things are worth fighting for.